Hello there, good morning, and welcome to China Now with me, Stanley Kwabla Arku, here on Pan African Television. Now, let's start with China Currents, where we track the stories making headlines across China and shaping its global outlook. On China Current today, a fiery exchange at Beijing Xiangshan Forum puts Gaza in sharp focus. Shenzhen professor clashed with an Israeli officer, rejecting claims that civilians are not being targeted and insisting that only a two-state solution can end the cycle of violence. The moment electrified the conference and drew wide support online. Now, meanwhile, the US-China tensions deepened as Washington blacklisted Chinese firms and Beijing hit back with probes into US chip makers. Yet, amid these friction, trade talks in Madrid showed signs of compromise, and President Trump soon softened his tone, calling the relationship the world's most important. Chris has more.
Welcome to China Currents. In this episode, a Chinese professor debates an Israeli officer on the Gaza conflict in front of representatives from more than 100 countries. Multiple runs of US-China confrontation last week with Trump striking softer tone. DeepSeek publishes a paper that once again caused self-doubts among peers. A top outdoor equipment brand fireworks stunt on Tibet sparks outrage in China. And Huawei unveils its 2035 tech forecast. Is it the future you want? Now let's start today's China Currents. On September 17th, at China's largest security conference, the Xiangshan Forum, a heated exchange between Tsinghua University professor Yan Xuetong and Israeli officer Gilad Shosha drew wide attention in China. In a viral video, Shosha defended Israel's conduct in Gaza, claiming it does not indiscriminately kill civilians. Yan rejected the claim, insisting soldiers must never target women and children. The fact is not decided by you, it's decided by the international community. Pressed on Hamas hostage, Yan argued that Israel must work with the UN, accept a two-state solution, create a Palestinian state, and cooperate with Palestine to fight terrorism. Otherwise, Israel will never win the war against terrorism. When Shosha said the war would end only if terrorists freed all the hostages and disarmed, Yan shot back. That propaganda is too much. No one believes it, except a few Israelis. The Xiangshan Forum, co-hosted by the China Association for Military Science and the China Institute of International Strategic Studies, gathers defense officials from over 100 countries each year. Attendees said the unscheduled, under 5-minute debate occurred just before Yan's opening speech when Shosha unexpectedly took the stage. Chinese netizens overwhelmingly back Yan's approach to resolving the conflict. And beyond the heated exchange at the Xiangshan Forum, the long-running US-China tariff war escalated again last week, with its fourth round marked by sharp moves and counter-moves akin to swordplay. On September 12th, the US Bureau of Industry and Security unexpectedly blacklisted 23 Chinese entities, citing threats to US national security or foreign policy interests. China responded swiftly. The Ministry of Commerce and the State Administration for Market Regulation launched an anti-dumping probe into US-origin analog chips and an antitrust investigation into NVIDIA. Fudan Microelectronics, one of the sanctioned firms, highlighted its robust supply chain, noting its strategic reserves of silicon wafers and key materials had risen from about $84.2 million in 2020 to $436 million in the first half of this year, signaling China's growing role in technological innovation. Meanwhile, US-China trade talks resumed in Madrid on September 14th to 15th, producing a framework to address TikTok-related issues, reducing investment barriers and promote economic cooperation. President Trump extended the TikTok ban deadline to December 16th. The week concluded with a September 19th phone call between the two leaders. Beijing described it as pragmatic, positive, and constructive, with positive signaling approval of Washington's recent tone, though unresolved issues remain. Trump, in his social media posts, struck a softer tone, calling US-China ties the world's most important bilateral relationship and emphasizing their potential contribution to global peace and stability. Chinese scholar Shen Yi noted that repeated US hints of Xi-Trump meeting, which was never confirmed by Chinese media, reflect underlying US anxiety. shifting focus from geopolitics to technology. At the start of this year, DeepSeek impressed the world with its low-cost, high-performance, open-source driven AI. On September 17th, its team published a paper in the top scientific journal, Nature, revealing details that once again left peers questioning themselves. Here are three key takeaways. First, the paper disclosed DeepSeek R1's exact training cost, just $294,000, with the total cost of building its foundation model only about $6 million. This is far below US competitors' claims. In 2023, OpenAI CEO Sam Altman said training a base model cost well over $100 million. CNBC noted DeepSeek had shattered the assumption that only nations with the fastest, most advanced chips could dominate the AI race. Second, the paper reviewed chips used. R1 was trained on 512 NVIDIA H800 GPUs. This directly rebutted US officials who had accused DeepSeek of secretly using large number of banned H100 chips. Third, the paper indirectly addressed accusations from US officials and AI experts that DeepSeek had illegally copied its algorithms. It clarified that DeepSeek's training data, which included many AI-generated responses from sources like OpenAI, came from web scraping, a common practice in training AI models, as it is the resulting model that is considered the core intellectual property. Tech blog TechSpace 2.0 commented that while OpenAI's GPT-4 and Google's Gemini remain ahead in some respects, R1 has democratized high-end AI in an unprecedented way by combining openness, lower replication costs, and efficiency. While DeepSeek was making waves in AI, outdoor gear and apparel brand Arc'teryx, known for its $700 jackets, triggered a PR crisis in China by lighting fireworks. On September 19th, Arc'teryx partnered with artist Chai Guoqiang to stage a fireworks show in Tibet's Himalayas. At an altitude of about 5,500 meters in a Gyansa-Rilong area, Chai set off 3 sequences of fireworks, creating the image of a dragon rising. He described the work as 145 fan-shaped smoke trail forming 3,000-meter-long rainbow. The event soon backfired. The fireworks were criticized for undermining an already fragile ecosystem, as the Himalayas poor soil water retention, slow vegetation recovery, and sensitive wildlife makes them vulnerable to disruption. The organizers claimed they used eco-friendly materials and had a protection plan. Many netizens were unconvinced, noting that degradation could take decades in such conditions. Worse, Arc'teryx's apology fueled further anger after the company released separate English and Chinese versions that vary significantly in tone, leading to accusations of insincerity. Critics charged that apologies without a concrete action plan are merely a form of public manipulation. This is not the first PR crisis for luxury brands in China. With rising consumer awareness, flashy campaigns no longer suffice. Brands are judged on whether they share Chinese consumers' values. Finally, let's look at the future. With AI advancing rapidly, humanoid robots learning new skills, new energy making power abundant, and low-altitude aircraft on the horizon, the world seems closer than ever to science fiction. Last week, China's tech giant Huawei released reports forecasting the worlds of 2035. Here are a few highlights. AGI, or Artificial General Intelligence, will move beyond being a super Google and enter the physical world. L4 Plus autonomous vehicles will be reality, no more clutching the wheel during emergencies, you can relax in the back seat. Total computing power will increase 100,000-fold, overturning today's paradigms. AI will help prevent over 80% of chronic diseases. Over 90% of Chinese households will own intelligent robots. AI adoption will surpass 85%, boosting productivity by 60% and restructuring value creation. Whether these predictions make you more excited for the future or more worrisome about it, as Huawei executive Wang Tao put it, more than ever we need forward-looking vision, and we need to let technological foresight and informed assumptions guide our path ahead. And that's all for today. See you next time.
Now in Thinkers Forum, we hear from Professor Stephen Zunes. He says the attack on Qatar revealed the contradictions of US policy, backing Israel unconditionally while claiming to mediate peace. He warns that real change may not come from governments, but from civil society, just as global solidarity helped end apartheid and the Vietnam War.
Well, the attacks on Qatar were of great concern because Qatar has seen itself as in the role of a mediator, not just in terms of Hamas and Israel, but in other issues involving Iran, involving the Taliban. So they like to think that they are a safe place, that they are a sanctuary where delegations from very different political tendencies can come together. Of course, bombing their country at all is a clear violation of international law, and also, of course, underscores the fact that Israel is not really interested in negotiated settlement. If you want a negotiated settlement, you do not try to kill the people you are negotiating with. What was particularly upsetting for Qatar is that the United States probably knew about it beforehand and did nothing to stop it. Trump says he warned them, but it was only after it was too late. But he very likely knew beforehand. And in any case, the United States, through its airborne radar and other sophisticated satellites and other sophisticated modes of tracking such things, certainly saw the squadron of Israeli jets heading towards Qatar, and could have ordered Israel to stop or given the Qatar government earlier warning. Remember, though, Israel that same week had bombed Lebanon, Syria, Yemen, Tunisia, in addition to Gaza, and only a few months earlier, Iran. But Qatar is a close ally of the West with very close commercial and strategic ties. And so the the Trump administration was willing to express some disapproval afterwards, though how sincere it was and how much of it was to simply reduce the damage in relations is hard to say. Regarding Gaza, the wanton destruction of large commercial and residential buildings that do not have any fighters in them, again, is a war crime. It is part of the ethnic cleansing of the largest city in the Gaza Strip. Wherever Israel's occupied, they have pretty much destroyed everything. Again, this is not buildings that happen to get destroyed in the course of a fighting. These are buildings, many of them are bombed, but many are just deliberately blown up, with planned explosives. And it appears that Israel is serious about the proposal that Trump made back in February that they agreed to, was essentially to bulldoze the entire territory, expel over 2 million people, and create a Mediterranean resort and high-tech zone. Indeed, just a few weeks ago, there was a 38-page prospectus for potential investors, for this new U.S.-Israeli controlled Gaza Strip. And, one would think that here in the 21st century, such, widespread ethnic cleansing, like that, and such a large-scale killing of civilians would be something that was, very much in the past. But when you have the support of the world's most powerful military, which has veto power in the Security Council, Israel figures they can get away with almost anything. Fundamentally, in terms of Israel and Palestine, the rights and security of both Israeli Jews and Palestinian Arabs need to be recognized, either as a viable two-state solution or a single binational state with equal rights and guaranteed security for both. Hamas, of course, does not support the rights of Israeli Jews to exist in Palestine. They want it all to be an Islamic state. But Israel, in many ways, is the mirror image. They want it to be a Jewish state for the entire area, from the Mediterranean to sea to the Jordan River. The most moderate party in the equation is the Palestine Authority, which is the recognized state of Palestine, led by the Palestine Liberation Organization, which is and the Fatah movement. But they only control the urban areas of most of the urban areas of the West Bank and some surrounding zones. The Israelis quite routinely bring their military into those areas as well. Meanwhile, Israel's colonizing the territory, surrounding the Arab towns and cities, and making the idea of a contiguous Palestinian state in the West Bank virtually impossible, which is why many people like myself, who for decades have been calling for a two-state solution, that is a Palestinian state on the West Bank in Gaza, including East Jerusalem, alongside Israel, are becoming concerned that it could be too late for that. I mean, the Palestine Authority's position, the state of Palestine, is they're willing to accept a Palestinian state in just 22% of Palestine. But Israel says no Palestinian state at all. And the U.S. says, yes, you could have a Palestinian state, but you have to give up part of that to Israeli settlements, and you can only do it on terms that Israel will agree to. But of course, Israel's not going to agree to it. Well, that was the traditional U.S. Position. I should clarify that under Trump, they don't support Palestinian statehood at all. The Democrats have supported a mini state under certain conditions that Israel's not willing to give. So neither party really has a realistic view. And the problem, really the reason there's been no Middle East peace is that the United States has played the contradictory role of being the sole mediator of the conflict, but also the primary military, financial, and diplomatic supporter of one of the two parties. Indeed, far more powerful of the two parties. And anybody who knows about diplomacy, mediation, that sort of thing, negotiations, know if you're going to have a mediator, they need to be objective. They need to be balanced. They shouldn't favor one side over the other, particularly the more powerful side. When the United States position is, oh, the two sides should work it out among themselves, it ignores the gross asymmetry in power between the two sides. It's between the occupying army, which is a regional superpower, and an occupied people. I mean, it'd be like when Iraq invaded Kuwait back in 1990. The United States didn't say, "Oh, you two need to work it out among yourselves." They recognized that one party was much weaker than the other, and the occupying power needed to withdraw. And the United States led the world in reversing the Iraqi occupation. Now, it was debatable whether war was necessary. Some of us believe we could have forced Iraq out without war, but everybody agreed that Iraq had to withdraw from Kuwait, that the occupation and annexation of Kuwait was illegitimate. And yet the United States seems to be willing to support Israel's occupation annexation, while at the same time claiming that Washington and only Washington should be the only outside power that oversees the negotiations. So the short answer to your question is, unfortunately, I'm very skeptical just that there can be any kind of real settlement as long as the United States plays this contradictory role. Unfortunately, as long as the United States uses its veto power, the Security Council doesn't have much power. Remember, it wasn't just Trump, but even Biden vetoed a number of otherwise unanimous Security Council resolutions trying to end the war. What is changing, and what could make a difference in the long term, is that a global civil society is mobilizing, including in the United States. I mentioned that the leadership of both political parties support Israel, but the American public increasingly is becoming more and more critical of Israel and more critical of both parties' position. And of course, we have seen around the world massive demonstrations. In total, millions and millions of people have come out, protesting because they see an ongoing genocide. We have seen in other cases of gross injustice such as the U.S. war on Vietnam, apartheid in South Africa, the U.S. intervention in Central America during the 1980s, other the Iraq War. You eventually people were eventually able to mobilize to force changes in policy, even on some fairly minor issues like East Timor. There was a real shift that popular protests in various countries like the United States and Australia and Britain and elsewhere ended up creating changes that allowed eventually for Timor-Leste to become free. So I think in the long term, there's some hope for civil society, but it's hard given the disproportionate power the United States has. Now, what other governments could do, especially those that have good relations with the United States, and perhaps they could pressure the United States more. But and the Europeans, even though they have been more critical of Israel, still haven't been willing to impose sanctions. I think that's very important. You need to really be able to impose sanctions. But I really do think that the international community needs to recognize this really is a genocide. There is really a moral and legal obligation to try to stop it, just as the world did regarding apartheid South Africa, Iraq's invasion of Kuwait, and other violations of international law. Most Americans, myself included, do believe in the ideals that the United States professes to believe in, such as freedom, democracy, the rule of law. Unfortunately, most of our wars, at least in recent decades, have not been really about these. We've often claimed they were, but it's not actually been the case. And there's always been a contradiction between the great ideals America has and the reality of our foreign policy. I mean, even at the beginning, in our Constitution and Declaration of Independence 250 years ago, were very progressive, idealistic documents, yet we were enslaving millions of Africans, and we were committing genocide against the indigenous Native Americans. And we have this contradiction, today as well, that we profess these ideals, and that's what American children learn in school about our foreign policy. And yet, the United States is the number one supporter of the world's remaining dictatorships. We're supporting a genocide right now in Gaza. And we supported earlier genocides too, like East Timor, like Guatemala in the 1980s. There have been a number of cases like this in the past. And so our government and sometimes the media will try to sell products saying this is about freedom. The official name of the invasion of Iraq was Operation Iraqi Freedom. During the Vietnam War, we said we're fighting in Vietnam to defend freedom, even though the Thieu regime in Saigon was a brutal, brutal right-wing dictatorship. Even where the United States, has some principle. For example, we say we're supporting Ukraine because and we're opposing Russia because no country can change its boundaries unilaterally. No country can expand its territory by force. Yet the United States is the only country in the world that has formally recognized Israel's illegal annexation of the Golan region of Syria and Morocco's illegal annexation of the entire nation of Western Sahara. There are these constant contradictions. And so, if Americans simply listen to what the president says, or some of the congressional leaders say, or some of the media says, they will often support what the government does. If the government says Iraq has these weapons of mass destruction that threaten the Middle East and the world, people might support it, except that it wasn't true. And so much of foreign policies are justified on things that aren't true. I'm fortunate because I am a professor and I study these things and I know about these things, that I and others can do our part to try to, tell the truth about these sorts of things. And there are also activists, and there are some more independent-minded journalists, and there are others who will raise these critiques because I think when most Americans really know the truth about our foreign policy, they are critical. They don't like the idea that we're supporting a genocide, that we're supporting repression, that we're supporting economic injustice, that we're doing things for the sake of American corporations or for other, narrow special interest and not for the good of the people there or ultimately for, for our good. And so over the years, I think Americans are becoming more and more skeptical they used to be. And also because, especially younger people, when I was growing up, we could only get our news from sort of the mainstream media, which tended to agree with the government on these things. Whereas now, young people, they through TikTok, through other things, they can get their news directly from the source. They can see on their telephone live from Gaza, the ongoing genocide. It's not filtered, through a pro-government media. And so that as a result, I think there's more skepticism. And the very fact that the United States fought in Vietnam had 500,000 troops because they had conscription, and most people were willing to go. The U.S. cannot have conscription today. They cannot have a draft today because I think most young people would say, no way. I'd fight to defend my country, but I'm not going to go overseas and fight an imperialist war. I think that is where we've really have a shift, a change. I think ultimately militarism, our intervention, our high military budget is really hurting us here in the United States. Over 50% of federal government research and development money goes for military purposes. I don't know what the figure is for China, but I'm sure it's much, much smaller than that. And that's why our best scientists and engineers are making, more bombs and more missiles and that kind of thing. Your best scientists and engineers are making renewable energy and advances in artificial intelligence and other technologies. The quality of our schools is deteriorating, along with our housing and our public transit and so many other things. Because again, we instead of investing in high-speed rail, we don't have any high-speed rail. I mean, um, we have homeless people on the street. Our schools are in very bad shape. The teachers are poorly paid, and the books, school books, are many years old, and all these kinds of things. And universities are unaffordable for many Americans. Yet, because we're spending more on the military than we are on the needs of people. And over half of the discretionary budget of the United States goes to the military. And indeed, some people argue that this has been a pattern historically for hundreds, if not thousands of years, where an empire will grow on its commercial strength. But to protect that commercial strength, they'll build up the military, but that will hurt their commercial strength, and then they build even more military to try to make up for it, and that just accelerates the decline. And we saw this in Rome, we saw this in Britain, we've seen this with other nations throughout history. And so I'm afraid that the United States is falling into the same kind of power because I really do think that soft power, country through economics, through its cultural aspects, through diplomacy, that is ultimately more effective than military power. Well, the Polisario Front, which is the nationalist movement that is the recognized government of Western Sahara, um, they recently resumed the armed struggle after 30 years because Morocco refused to go ahead with the referendum for self-determination as they promised, and they kept violating the ceasefire. But it is more of a propaganda of the deed. It's a low-level conflict, and they've never engaged in terrorism. They have never questioned Morocco's right to exist. It is a majority, it is a Muslim people, but they don't impose a reactionary religion on people. They're secular in terms of their governance. Women have equal rights and that sort of thing. But and within Western Sahara, there has been an impressive nonviolent resistance movement against the occupation. The problem, though, is that Morocco has colonized Western Sahara, so that Moroccan settlers are outnumber the indigenous Sahrawis. And despite the moderation of the Polisario, they have not gotten the support of Western governments. I mean, when we look at the Palestinians, we say, they're divided in different factions. You have Fatah, you have Hamas, Islamic Jihad, other groups. Some of those groups, like Hamas, engage in terrorism. Some of them don't recognize Israel's right to exist. None of them are particularly democratic. But the Polisario, they've never engaged in terrorism or Morocco's right to exist. They are people are unified in their support, and they have democratic elections, and yet still they're not getting the support, and so that sends a bad message, you know, that to the Arab and Islamic world. We do the things that the West wants us to do, and they still won't support us. But at the same time, I think the underlying principle that I talk about nonviolent action, even though it has not been successful in Western Sahara, it recognizes that ultimately a state is only as powerful as people's willingness to obey it. That every government, no matter how repressive or corrupt or anything else, is ultimately dependent on civil servants to do the government's work, for the police and military to obey their orders, for people to pay their taxes, cooperation. When governments, lose their legitimacy in the eyes of the people, they become vulnerable, no matter how strong how powerful they are in terms of their military. So it is, and we've seen more and more cases where people have been able to rise up and challenge, government authority. I mean, it was not the armed wing of the African National Congress that ended apartheid. It was the workers in the township, the black workers that the white minority was dependent on, combined with international sanctions made possible by popular anti-apartheid movements that brought it down. And we can look at other, dictatorship in Latin America and in other parts of the world, that we were brought down not because of foreign invasion or or the military coming in a coup or even armed revolution, but by general strikes, massive civil resistance, and the like. It's something that we need to study more. I mean, we have studied the art of war, going back how many thousands of years. In the West, you had Machiavelli, that's more 500 years ago. So we've studied war for a long, long time, but we haven't done the same kind of study of unarmed resistance, of civil resistance. And I think there's a lot to learn from that. Unfortunately, when you're being bombed like the people in Gaza are, it's hard to imagine any kind of nonviolent resistance or even armed struggle stopping that, given the power of the Israeli military. And in the West Bank, there has been very impressive nonviolent resistance over the years, and there continues to be. But when you have these right-wing settler militia and the destruction of villages, and the like, and again, they are outnumbered by the Israelis. It's hard that they alone cannot do it. And that's where global civil society comes in. And I think we can learn a lot from the anti-apartheid movement because, corporations found South Africa, very lucrative investment, because you had the white society consumer society that could buy their products and a cheap black labor that could be exploited. It was like having the first world and third world in one country. So it was very, very profitable. Under capitalism, they had no incentive to put sanctions on South Africa. And Western nations also saw apartheid South Africa as good anti-communist during the Cold War. But it was ordinary people in the United States, in Europe, and around the world, along with progressive nations that supported South Africa freedom, that eventually forced the United States and the British and the French and others to finally put sanctions on South Africa and stop supporting it. I mentioned the international solidarity for Timor-Leste, East Timor, and the importance that that made, and of course eventually getting the United States to get out of Vietnam. I do believe that we are living in an increasingly globalized world. And certainly there are different visions of what globalization, looks like. You have the neoliberalism in the West, you have BRICS, you have, competing visions. But in any case, the degree of communication, of interdependence, of the fact that we can't instantly communicate with anybody anywhere in the world is something that really puts the responsibility on all of us if there is injustice. And that I really think is the future. When I was born in the 1950s, the United States had the power to come in and overthrow governments in places like Guatemala and Iran, and we could do all sorts of things. We can't get away with that anymore. We can still do a lot of damage, but we don't have the power we used to, not just because we live in a more heterogeneous world, but also because the power of ordinary people is more. People are empowered, and I think that really is where my hope is. Well, first of all, I think there are still some openings for nonviolent resistance in the West Bank, but not that's not won't be enough. It does have to indeed be international. I think what it comes to pressure our governments to put sanctions on Israel, just as we put pressure on our governments to put sanctions on apartheid South Africa. And that is certainly first and foremost to stop the military aid, transfer of arms. But also Israel's high-tech companies rely on cooperations with high-tech companies around the world. Well, if they say, "Hey, we're not going to have business with you as long as you're committing genocide, as long as you are engaging in illegal occupation, we won't." Remember, Israel's very powerful militarily, but they're a fairly small country. And so they're dependent for trade, and so in terms of oil, in terms of many certain food, even there's a lot of clout that countries can impose. But it's a matter of political will. And obviously, there are, as with South Africa, there's some powerful corporations. The arms industry is very, very powerful, of course, and other commercial interests. So, there needs to be a counter to that, and from ordinary people. For one thing, we do see the terrible legacy of colonialism, and the way the European powers came in after World War I and carved up the Middle East after the collapse of the Ottomans. Used to be able to, and travel throughout the region. You had Muslims and Jews and Christians, living, pretty harmoniously together. And the West comes in and draws these artificial boundaries and engages in the French and the British, and then later the Americans start to do these divide and rule kind of tactics to get Christians and Muslims against each other, and Sunni and Shia Muslims against each other, and Jews to have their own state, and these and all the conflict that comes from that. It is unfortunately a lesson about the horrors of European colonialism, and what that has caused, and people are still suffering from this day. I think it shows that dependence on single exports are very dangerous. I mean, to be so reliant on oil, as many of the states are, not only does the price go up and down and up and down, and it's very hard to plan economically if your income can be so different from year to year. It makes it difficult to diversify the economy, and for a healthy middle class to develop, and for stable political system to develop, you need a strong middle class. So you can't have just a handful of rich people controlling most of the wealth, and that has perpetuated the repression and these old style family dictatorships. I mean, most countries got rid of their monarchs, or at least reduced them to figureheads a long time ago. But in the Middle East, you still have these royal families ruling everything. It just seems very anachronistic. But it also showed us, that the Arab Spring, that ordinary people still can make a difference, and the Arab Spring did not end well. I mean, that most of those uprisings ended up, failing to various levels. But the initial European uprisings in 1848 failed, but it got better, and we've seen we've seen in Chinese and other histories, some of the initial uprisings ended up being crushed or caused a lot of deaths and didn't go very far, and yet they sowed the seeds for more better change, later on. And I think that we must not rule out, even in the face of a genocide and occupation, even in the face of these family dictatorships, even in the face of sectarian conflict, that the people in the Middle East are like people anywhere. Well, they want safety for their family. They want accountable government. They want justice. They want to have enough money to get the basic things to be happy, for education for their children, to be able to live a good life. I think we need to underscore, to remember, that despite the very different histories and cultures, that the basic human desires are the same, and that the role of governments that have a strong international presence, like the United States, like China, like some of the European countries, should pursue policies that can help ordinary people in the Middle East and elsewhere achieve their dreams.
And that brings us to the end of China Now here on Pan African Television with me, Stanley Kwabla Arku. Please don't forget to share your thoughts, feedback with us through the email provided below. I am Stanley Kwabla Arku. Thanks for your company.